Castaway then. A film that took so long to make that its director could go away for a year in the middle of it, make and release a whole other hit movie as well. Let's dig into it.
Stories. We would be honoured if you would join us.
The story of Castaway, directed by Robert Zemeckis, written by William Brawes Jr. and starring Tom Hanks and Helen Hunt, goes back to Tom Hanks. And he explained this in a roundtable interview with The Hollywood Reporter in 2017, that he'd seen... I think he'd read an article about Federal Express, and he said, I realised that 747s filled with packages fly across the Pacific Ocean 3 times a day. And I just thought, well, what happens if that goes down? And so, I mean, he would expand on that. He'd say, I made Castaway because I wanted to examine the concept of 4 years of hopelessness in which you have none of the requirements for living: food, water, shelter, fire and company. But he says it took us 6 years to put together the alliance that would actually examine that. I only had a third of it. Bill Broyles, coming to him, only had a third of it. Robert Zemeckis comes along and provided the other third. But the original idea came from Hanks, and he'd come into the work of William Brawes Jr. just a few years earlier, actually, with Apollo 13, which was a movie that that Broyles wrote for Ron Howard. Other people came in. I'll come to that in a second. But Tom Hanks, contextually, in the 1990s, had the clout to pretty much do what he wanted. Those back-to-back Oscar wins for Philadelphia, and then with Robert Zemeckis for Forrest Gump, meant he had that, I mean, the absolute crossover between critical acclaim and commercial performance. I mean, he was a movie star making really good films. Look at what, was it 96, 98, was it, that Saving Private Ryan came out? That came out the same year as, I mean, if you look at it, it came out the same year as You've Got Mail. Saving Private Ryan in 1998. 2 films side by side. Saving Private Ryan goes on to get Best Picture Oscar nomination, another Oscar nomination for Hanks as well. You've Got Mail, huge box office hit. Hanks absolutely top of the world. I mean, you then look at 1999, the year after, he had Toy Story 2 and The Green Mile. Again, contrasting projects, going for completely different audiences. 2 huge hits. The Green Mile, Best Picture Oscar nomination. He'd done his directorial debut, That Thing You Do. Crikey, by this stage. He was producing TV as well for Earth to the Moon, Band of Brothers. He was involved in those. But so he was using this clout and he was producing films. But it was Castaway that was quite a difficult nut to crack, and it would take quite a while to do. William Brawes Jr., let's go to him, because he talked about this in a very long piece with the Austin Chronicle. And, I mean, he discussed trying to crack the idea of it and the script of it. Because, I mean, he'd penned Apollo 13, and he'd been hired also to work on Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes film by the time the interviews were being done. And so to get into the headspace of what he needed to do here, he went off to the Sea of Cortez in Mexico to go and live by himself, basically for a few days, for a week or so, just to get the idea of what his central character in what would become Castaway would be. And he describes how he built himself a lean-to made of bamboo and palm leaves. He spent a day and a half trying to make fire. He said, I rubbed sticks together, I twirled them. Finally, I had to get these primitive technology guys and just say, I can't eat any more raw stingray. It was a whole bunch of personal experiences as part of the research process for the movie that ended up going into what became Castaway. Certainly what went into those early drafts of his scripts. Because, as he described, the experience would give Broyles an understanding of what it meant to be alone, how that affects time, how he was tracking time by the tide, by the stars, didn't have a watch that was working. He was bored for long periods of time. How do you deal with that? And so he said, that's when I realised it wasn't just a physical challenge, it was going to be an emotional, spiritual one as well. And so he fashioned this character called Chuck Noland. As better people than me noticed before me, see no land. He got this character, and the idea was he's going to put him on this island for years. But what do you do? How do you make that work where you've got one character on screen for like an hour, pretty much by himself? Well, while he was in Mexico, while he was at the Sea of Cortez, he saw a volleyball on a beach. And wouldn't you know, he gave it a name, Wilson. And I mean, by the time we got to the actual film, Tom Hanks would paint a face on it, and an unlikely movie icon would be created. But it was a real eureka moment because, in a strange way, he had his supporting character. He had someone for his central character to interact with, and it was a volleyball. However, the story of Castaway is also two significant pieces of very offbeat. I'd call it product placement, but they weren't paid for. So I'm going to come back to that just shortly. Let's bring in Robert Zemeckis, because Zemeckis was the third part of the creative team. If we look at where he was at this point, I mean, 1997, he'd done Contact. I love Contact, a terrific, terrific film. And he was interested in working with Hanks again. And I mean, when Zemeckis was then lured on to this, I mean, he had a chat with William Broyles Jr. because Broyles Jr. hadn't had the best of times on his previous films because he got the script to certain points, but then he'd been replaced and rewritten. And Zemeckis assured him, if I'm coming on, you're sticking with it. You ain't going to be fired. You're going to be part and parcel with this. And what it formed was this collaboration between three people: star, director, writer. And the story, the script was constantly evolving as each part of that jigsaw came together. And also as they were responding to other things going on. They went to see, say, Patch Adams, the Robin Williams headlined film from Tom Shadyac. There was a scene in that that was a little bit close to what they were doing. So they adjusted their version of the story again. And as Broyles would say, we worked on it for 6 years. And he said, even at the end, you're still getting ideas for how to do something better. And by the time it got to the premiere of the film, just jumping to the end of the story a little bit, Broyles and Zemeckis were said to be discussing one of the scenes in the movie they wished they'd done differently. And I mean, they're just looking at it even at that point and trying to work out how to do it. It was clear this was going to come together from about 1998. It was going to be Fox and DreamWorks that were going to share the weight, of the financial weight and the distribution of the film. Tom Hanks was going to come in, and this was going to be a very, very pronounced character challenge for him. To put this into context, he'd come off Saving Private Ryan, which had involved grueling boot camps and a very, very tough shoot. What he needed to do for Castaway was to present a character really in 2 or 3 different physical states, even before you get to the emotional side of it. That the character of Chuck Nolan we see at the start of the film is a much bulkier man, and then you have to get to a point where you believe that this guy's been on an island for years. And so the weight variation was going to be quite pronounced. And Hanks, in the first instance, would need to bulk up. He would need to put the weight on, but it was going to lead to a very, very unusual production schedule for the movie. Then there were a couple of hurdles involving 2 brand names that the producers, that the creative team wanted to bring into the film. So Federal Express is a key one. Let's call them FedEx. Now, the script called for a FedEx plane to crash and for a package to be heavily delayed in its delivery. And so they had to approach FedEx and just say, we need your plane. We need to crash the plane. We need to show one of your packages is not being delivered on time. Imagine that, FedEx not turning up on time. So there was speculation in a long piece in the Chicago Tribune that I found after the film came out that it was estimated FedEx had paid millions of dollars, or certainly could have been charged millions of dollars for such is the way the company's woven into Castaway. It was Sandra Munoz, spokeswoman at the company's headquarters, said, people find it hard to believe, but we didn't pay a dime to be in the movie. The movie makers approached us and we had to think long and hard about whether to participate. And so they were shown the script and they took a look at the script and they said they decided the script highlighting the company's humble origins, its global reach, its can-do spirit, outweighed the aircraft disaster. And FedEx decided, do you know what? Yeah, we're going to do this, and offered filming locations, let the filmmakers into its package sorting hubs at 2 or 3 different airports. They were offered planes, trucks, uniforms as well. Now, on the flip side of it, a couple of people from FedEx were monitoring the production throughout the filming. But as Gail Christensen, who was at the time the managing director, I love these job titles, managing director for global brand management of FedEx, she said, it's not product placement. We're a character in this movie. That's what they looked at it and thought. It's not just a product on the screen. It transcends product placement. And that's why they said yes. And then there was Wilson, this volleyball that they needed, and it was called Wilson. It had the Wilson logo on it. They needed to get permission off Wilson Sporting Goods Company, but it was a different kind of permission again. And I mean, Wilson Sporting Goods wrote a long blog on its website about this as well. and described the chronology of how it turned out. That in 1998, they wrote, a call came into Team Sports Communications Manager Molly Wallace. It described that call as unlike any she'd ever received. And it was someone from 20th Century Fox. And the representative from Fox said to Molly Wallace that the studio was going to be making this film, and could Wilson, the company, provide some balls that they could use in the film. And director of basketball, volleyball and soccer, Mike Kearney, I think, says nowadays production companies want big money for product placement. At the time, that wasn't the case. They just wanted the balls. And let's go back to Molly Wallace. They were very vague about the film and how the product would be used, but they assured Wilson, the company, not the ball, that it wouldn't be used as a weapon or in any way that was damaging to its brand. And so it was a leap of faith that the company was being asked to take. Now, contextualising this, it was only a few years earlier that Coca-Cola had blindly given permission for Oliver Stone for its advert to appear in the middle of Natural Born Killers. And when Coca-Cola saw how it appeared in the middle of Natural Born Killers, no spoilers, Coca-Cola got serious about product placement and about how its sticky, overpriced, really unhealthy American soft drinks were being portrayed on film. So there was some fear that product placement could go wrong. Hollywood was really waking up to, actually, there might be a thing as bad publicity here. So there was a degree of leap of faith here. But then the rep from Fox said, well, it's going to be an unusual film. There wasn't going to be much of a cast, but it's got Tom Hanks in it. And Tom Hanks was like the bit that turned them. As Molly Wallace wrote, he told me it was Tom Hanks. And I think that's what ultimately sealed the deal. Tom Hanks movies, they're always good. There's a challenge. And so Wilson sent over a load of footballs, British footballs, soccer balls, if you must. But they weren't working. And as the message went back about this mysterious film to Wilson, they came back and said the soccer balls weren't working because something wouldn't adhere to the soccer ball material. So they asked for some volleyballs. So Wilson sent over some volleyballs. However, at the time, Wilson Sporting Goods was printing the Wilson logo on both sides of the volleyballs. Well, that wouldn't do. They only needed it printed on one side. And I mean, they said we had no idea why they needed that, but we did it. We made 60 one-sided volleyballs and sent them off to Fox. What a commercial decision that would turn out to be for the company. That's when we really started wondering, they wrote, why did they need that? What could they be doing with one-sided balls? There's a sentence I've never said before. All they knew at that point was that a one-sided Wilson volleyball was going to be in a Tom Hanks film. And basically, for a year and more, that is all they knew. The film was shooting. They had no idea. They didn't see a script. They were shown a photo eventually, but they had to sign an NDA just so that they could see how it would look in the film. The first time they saw footage, moving footage of their ball in the Tom Hanks movie, was they were invited to a critics screening, and it was way too late. January the 18th, 1999 was the start of production of Castaway. And again, I mean, what a story this is. The first 3-4 months, they were just shooting on an island in the Fiji area, as part of Fiji, to get the bits of the story where Chuck Noland is first living on the desert island. And I'm going to spoil a light, but we get a tiny bit into the plot just by nature of the chronology of this story. They did that first 3-4 months of shooting and then they stopped. Now, there's not a huge number of films that take so long to physically make that the director can go away and make another entirely in the middle. Now, we see it with animation. We see people directing an animated film and a live action film side by side. I think that I always think sometimes there's people in the animation team who aren't necessarily getting the director credit they deserve. I don't know. That's just my thought. But Steven Spielberg sort of did it with Ready Player One, that he shot Ready Player One, realised the effects on that were going to take, 18 months to realise, so went and made the post start to finish and released it in the interim. But physical production, at least, was complete. He'd shot Ready Player One by the time he went off to do the post. The extraordinary story of Castaway is filming stopped. Tom Hanks then had to go away for a year and slim right down. He put all this weight on. Now he had to take all this weight off. And Robert Zemeckis had the opportunity to make the film What Lies Beneath, a big movie star movie. Harrison Ford, Michelle Pfeiffer. They all had gaps in the schedule. They had to get it done in 12 months, start to finish. And it was released before Castaway. It started shooting after was released before. And it wasn't, I think it was April 2000, so 14 months down the line, when production on Castaway could start again. I mean, Hanks had come in and seen Zemeckis on the set of What Lies Beneath, the What Lies Beneath team. We said, how are you getting on? They all knew what he was doing. He arrived back 5 stone later, filming recommences. And the year when, I mean, I said earlier, Hanks was prolific at this point. He was making a film a year, sometimes 2 films a year, and now he'd had to basically stop making them for a year to get back into the shape required for the Chuck Nolan character at this part of the story. And he described it as a miserable time. Also, when he'd left Fiji for the first time, he got a cut on his leg and it become infected. And as he would tell the National Enquirer, the doctor said to me, "What's the matter with you? You could have died from this thing." And they had to take a chunk of this infection out of his leg that required it. And the infection got so bad that he had to stay in hospital for 3 days. And so the initial tranche of production had to shut down for 3 weeks because Hanks couldn't get back in the water until this infection had gone. So they then shot the next chunk, and then they had to work out the ending, which they struggled to nail for a long time. And so they effectively ended up with a third chunk of film, and they took a couple of months out to sort out what the final act of the movie would look like before shooting that. It had taken Robert Zemeckis longer to shoot Castaway, pretty much 2 years, than it took him to shoot 2 Back to the Future movies back to back. Such was the prolonged nature of the production. December the 22nd, 2000, it was going to be released. Alan Silvestri came in, did a really sparse score for it, actually. It's quite an unusual score. And, I mean, it went in front of critics, and the critical response to it was strong. I don't think it was outright adored, but certainly Tom Hanks's performance was. It was a real turning point, actually, for me watching Tom Hanks as well, because I just looked at it, I just thought, what you're doing is really astonishingly difficult. Holding the screen, I mean, it's a proper movie star performance as well, with a whole ton of really good acting. And you know, it's one of those where I'm just watching, I don't know how you do it. I always thought if you went back to, say, something like Philadelphia, which arguably, I mean, that was his big first massively acclaimed role. It's Denzel Washington who has the trickier role in that. I think Denzel Washington's performance in Philadelphia is astonishing. If you look at Forrest Gump, it's a really good movie star role. I have problems with the film, but, you know, fair dues. I understand why that got the success it did. I think there's nuance in Castaway and Chuck Nolan. I thought it was a real step up. Same with Private Ryan, actually. There was respect, too, for the evolution of Robert Zemeckis as a filmmaker here, because, I mean, Robert Zemeckis had a reputation, it's unfair, really, that it was always the technology that interested him. Well, look at Contact. Look at the first Back to the Future. You know, this guy romancing the stone. This guy knows how to tell a story. Sure, he harnesses technology where as much as he can or as much as he needs to for that, but fundamentally, he knows how to tell a story. The film then gets good to very good reviews. Hanks gets excellent reviews. Hanks would get another Oscar nomination for Best Actor. He wouldn't win it, but he'd get the Oscar nomination. I think he won the Golden Globe, but they don't count. And The Sound got nominated for an Oscar as well, but nothing else. This wasn't his most rewarded film. However, when it went in front of audiences, I mean, it came out Christmas 2000 in the US, December the 22nd to the 24th, opens top spot, 28.8 million, and top spot by a lot. Second place was What Women Want with Mel Gibson, and you know, I mean, that was at 15 million on its second weekend, and just like Castaway had beaten it by a fair amount. One interesting thing about that as well is you've got Helen Hunt in first and second place at the American box office that weekend, as in Castaway and as the co-lead and the best thing in What Women Want. Ron Howard's How the Grinch Stole Christmas was in third. Nicolas Cage in Brett Ratner's The Family Man was in fourth. Miss Congeniality in fifth. So Castaway, The Family Man, Miss Congeniality all open that same weekend. It's Christmas, so it's going to be busy. Disney's hugely underrated The Emperor's New Groove was in the chart. Vertical Limit was in 7th. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon in 8th. Meet the Parents, Charlie's Angels. I mean, it was a very, very busy chart, but it was Castaway that held out over the Christmas break and was over 100 million by the end of 2000. There wasn't a lot of new launches after that bunch, but Castaway was on its way to be a huge success. Traffic came along. At the start of January, it had done a limited release just to qualify for Oscars, and so that jumped up to third place by the time Castaway's on its third weekend. But Castaway, What Women Want, still topping the chart. There's Helen Hunt ruling the box office, and it was the brilliant Save the Last Dance that knocked it off the top in the end, with a 23 million opening weekend, just knocking Castaway down. But by the time Castaway had finished its run at the US box office, let's have a look. 233 million. Outside of the US, 196 million. This was a hugely, hugely successful film, and selling. It cost in the end about 90 million to make, which, when you consider how long commercially, physically, it had taken to make, I wouldn't call it frugal. I don't have that kind of money, but it does seem a fairly good investment in the end. There were a couple of ramifications from it. 20th Century Fox bizarrely didn't, in the first instance, give Wilson Sporting Goods permission to do tie-in Wilson volleyballs for the film. And Fox had some leverage here because no money had changed hands. This was not a paid product placement, and Wilson, the company, had handed over permission. Eventually, Fox relented, and as late as 2022, the Wilson Sporting Goods company was saying it still sells over 20,000 Castaway Wilson volleyballs a year. And according to its blog, they are Tom Hanks's most requested autographed item. I've not asked Tom Hanks this, but, I can see it. Let's just put it that way. Also, Tom Hanks has talked about the ramifications of a bunch of roles he was taking on. Because, in the 90s, his weight was all over the place for the work that he was taking on. So for Penny Marshall's A League of Their Own, he put weight on. For Jonathan Demme's Philadelphia, he took weight off. In the case of Castaway, he added weight, he lost weight. And in 2013, Hanks revealed in an interview that he developed type 2 diabetes. The cause of that was believed to be the dramatic weight changes in the work. Certainly that had been a contributory factor to it. And he reflected that he'd been, quote, an idiot, and he would no longer take on roles that would involve that amount of dramatic weight fluctuation. We still see some actors do it, but there is a health knock-on to that. And Hanks now is paying some degree of price for it, really. One final thing on Castaway as well. It's had cultural ramifications too. The Wilson is now, I think that, didn't the original Wilson sell at auction as well for a ridiculous amount of money? This is a film that's absolutely endured. But also, if it hadn't have been for Castaway, the story goes, we'd have never have got the TV series Lost. Imagine that. And so the story there is that there was development work being done on a Castaway television series that went nowhere, but via the, chaos theory, the sliding doors, the molecule smashing, however you want to do it, it was the ignition of a Castaway TV series that got to the right creatives in the end, that it was kind of corralled towards something different, wildly different in the end, and that's how we got Lost. So, as a result of three people coming together, William Broyles Jr., who I name check again, Robert Zemeckis, and Tom Hanks reading an article in the early 1990s, not only do we get a much loved film, we also get one of the most contentious and divisive television series of its era. I should read more articles.